Hey guys, tonight we are drifting back into a world so old that even the desert seems tired of remembering it. So settle in, breathe slow, and let the story move at its own pace. We're not rushing anywhere. This is not a tale of battles or empires collapsing in flames. It's quieter than that, and somehow stranger. We're heading into a dry valley where survival was never guaranteed, and yet a civilization chose cooperation over conquest and somehow made it work. This is Carol. In a land where life should have been short and difficult, Carol didn't just survive, it organized, it planned, it endured. The valley was harsh, baked by the sun, with a river that could give life or take it away depending on the season. Most people would have passed through and kept going, but the people who settled here stayed. They watched, they learned, they adapted. They didn't try to dominate the land, they worked with it. And slowly, a city emerged. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily as generations stacked knowledge the same way they stacked stone. Karl grew into something extraordinary. The city rose out of the desert with a confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Its pyramids stood broad and grounded, not sharp or aggressive. They didn't loom to intimidate, they waited. The pyramids of Karol confuse expectations because they look important without trying to prove it. These weren't crude piles of stone. They were carefully planned structures shaped by people who understood balance, weight, and time. At the center of it all stood the largest structure, the Pyramid Maya. It stretched across the valley floor, long and solid, and climbed upward with a calm authority. It wasn't tall for the sake of being tall, it was wide, built to last. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, its design absorbed the movement of the earth itself. Earthquakes shook the valley over centuries, and still the pyramid remained. It bent, it settled, but it did not fall, and it stood there for nearly 5,000 years, quietly proving its builders knew exactly what they were doing. Unlike other ancient pyramids, this one was not built to house the dead. It wasn't a tomb, it was alive. Temples crowned its summit, reached by wide staircases that welcomed people upward. Fires burned there, rituals unfolded beneath an open sky. Below, large sunken plazas spread outward, circular and intentional, designed to gather people together. These spaces weren't for spectacle. They were for participation, for ceremony, for shared moments. The city itself tells a story through its layout. Structures were positioned with care, aligned with the movements of the sun and the slow rhythm of the stars. Architecture here was more than shelter. It carried meaning. It reflected the deep connection between daily life and the cosmos. Buildings marked solstices. Seasons were tracked through stone and shadow. In a world without writing, these alignments held memory. They told people when to plant, when to gather, when to prepare. Walking through Karal even now carries a strange sense of calm. These structures were raised without metal tools, without wheels, without animals to carry heavy loads. And yet, the precision is undeniable. The symmetry, the scale, the patience required to build something meant to outlast its creators. The pyramids were not symbols of vanity. They weren't statements of dominance. They were bridges, linking earth and sky, community and belief. One of the most striking things about Karl is what isn't there. Archaeologists found no weapons, no walls, no fortifications, no mass graves. There is no evidence of war or organized violence, and that absence is loud. In a world where power usually left scars, Karl seems to have chosen another path. This was a society that invested its energy elsewhere, not in armies, but in organization, not in conquest, but in connection. Trade flowed through the valley like a second river. Cotton grown along the riverbanks was spun into fishing nets. These nets traveled to the coast. In return came dried fish, shells, and goods from distant regions, stones from the highlands, exotic items from far valleys. This exchange bound communities together in a web of mutual reliance. Carroll sat at the center of it all, not as a ruler, but as a connector. Religious life reinforced this harmony. The plazas likely hosted ceremonies that brought people together under shared beliefs. Music filled these gatherings. Flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, whistles shaped from antlers, drums stretched with animal hide. These instruments were carefully made, tuned to specific tones, designed to carry sound across open spaces. In a world without written words, music became a language of its own. It spoke of cycles, of belonging, of shared purpose. As dusk settled over the valley, drums would have echoed softly, flutes would have risen with the wind. People gathered not in fear, but in rhythm. Leadership in Caral appears to have rested on organization and spiritual authority rather than force. Someone coordinated construction, someone managed irrigation, someone oversaw trade routes. These roles required trust and cooperation, and remarkably, they left no signs of violence behind. Instead of monuments to victory, Carroll built spaces for gathering and reflection. Music and ritual were woven into daily life. The city itself seems designed around ceremony. Sunken plazas acted like natural amphitheaters, focusing sound and attention. Pyramids rose above like human made mountains, linking the ground beneath their feet to the sky overhead. Rituals likely marked the turning of seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the steady movement of celestial bodies. Music was not entertainment, it was connection. It linked people to each other, to the land, and to forces beyond their control. There are no signs of violent gods here, no imagery of terror or sacrifice. The spiritual world of Carroll seems grounded in balance and reverence. Even now, when the wind moves through the ruins, it feels easy to imagine echoes of ancient sound. Carroll was also an engineering achievement. Without advanced tools, its builders shaped stone and earth into structures that endured. Reed bags carried heavy rocks across the valley. Layer upon layer was placed with care. The region was prone to earthquakes, yet the city survived thanks to flexible construction and wide foundations. Water management was equally sophisticated. Canals guided river water to fields, allowing crops to grow despite the surrounding desert. Every drop mattered. The city's layout reflected thoughtful planning. Residential areas, ceremonial spaces, and administrative zones were arranged in harmony. The people of Caral built with the future in mind, not just for themselves, but for generations. And then, slowly, the city emptied. There was no sudden destruction, no invasion, no dramatic end. Caral faded. Some believe drought strained agriculture. Others suggest trade routes shifted. Perhaps internal pressures quietly took their toll. The departure appears gradual. Families left one by one, seeking more reliable land. The desert moved back in, sand-filled plazas, stone softened beneath time. For thousands of years, Carroll slept beneath the dunes, waiting. The silence that followed was not sudden. It stretched, it settled. The kind of silence that only forms when people leave carefully, not in panic, but with resignation. The plazas that once held voices slowly emptied, footsteps faded, fire pits went cold. The wind became the loudest thing left. At first, the city probably still felt alive. Stone holds memory. Fires may have still been lit occasionally by those who lingered. But eventually, even that stopped. The river continued its course, unconcerned. The desert did what deserts always do. It reclaimed. Carroll did not collapse. It dissolved. And that difference matters. When a city burns, it leaves scars. When it fades, it leaves questions. For centuries, Carroll existed as little more than shape, round mounds rising gently from the valley floor. Travelers passed them without pause. They looked natural, unremarkable, the kind of formations the earth makes when left alone. And so the city slept, not ruined, not destroyed, just waiting. Time moved differently here. Seasons cycled. Stars traced the same paths across the sky the builders once watched. The pyramids endured earthquakes and storms without complaint. They had been built for this. They had been built with patience. The stones remembered even when people forgot. When the city was finally uncovered again, it did not reveal drama. It revealed discipline. Layer by layer, sand was brushed aside, and beneath it emerged intention. Walls that made sense, staircases that led somewhere, plazas that invited gathering. The shapes were unmistakable. This was not nature. This was planning. This was a city. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. Carroll was ancient, not just old, but foundational. It existed at the same time as the earliest civilizations elsewhere in the world, and yet it had grown its own way, following its own logic. The Americas had not waited. They had not borrowed. They had built. When artifacts surfaced, they told a quiet story. Fishing nets woven from cotton, musical instruments shaped with care, textiles, not records, offerings left deliberately, not hastily. These were traces of daily life, not moments of crisis. There were no hoards hidden in fear, no signs of last stands. This had been a society that trusted continuity, and for a long time it had been right. The rediscovery of Caral did more than add a new chapter to history. It challenged assumptions. It forced a reevaluation of what civilization looks like, because Caral did not fit the usual pattern. There were no kings carved in stone, no lists of conquests, no monuments screaming authority. Instead, there was balance, there was coordination, there was restraint. The people of Caral had managed complexity without glorifying dominance. They had organized labor without visible coercion. They had sustained trade networks without militarizing them. This does not mean life was easy. It means their response to difficulty was different. The environment was unforgiving. The desert offered no margin for error. Water had to be managed carefully. Agriculture required precision, irrigation channels, guided river water with intent. Fields were planned, crops were chosen wisely. Cotton was prioritized not for food, but for function, because cotton meant nets, and nets meant fish, and fish meant protein. This was strategic thinking rooted in survival. The success of this system depended on cooperation. Farmers, fishermen, builders, craftspeople, ritual leaders all relied on one another. Disruption would have rippled outward quickly. And yet, the city endured for centuries. That kind of longevity does not come from fear, it comes from alignment. The architecture reflects this alignment. Structures are not crowded, they breathe. Space is intentional. Plazas are large, open, welcoming. The sunken design draws people inward rather than pushing them back. Sound travels differently here. Music gathers rather than scatters. The builders understood acoustics even if they did not name it. They understood how sound could unite a crowd, how rhythm could synchronize movement, how shared experience could reinforce belonging. Music was woven into ceremony, but also into identity. Instruments were not decorative, they were functional, they were tools for cohesion. The choice of materials mattered. Bone from condors and pelicans carried symbolic weight. These were animals connected to sky and water. Sound itself became a bridge between realms. The act of gathering mattered. In a society without writing, collective ritual was memory. It was instruction. It was continuity. Stories lived in repetition, in rhythm, in shared motion. And Caral was built to support that. Plazas were not afterthoughts, they were central. The pyramids rose above them not as symbols of authority, but as anchors. They marked time, they marked space, they oriented people within the world. Their alignment with celestial cycles was not decorative, it was practical. The stars told them when to plant, when to expect change, when to prepare. Architecture became a tool for survival, and survival became a communal effort. The absence of weapons is striking, but it does not imply naivete. It suggests confidence. Trade networks extended far enough that isolation was not an option. Interdependence created stability. When goods flow, borders soften. When communication is constant, mistrust has less room to grow. Carral's influence likely rested not in dominance, but in reliability. They provided what others needed, and others returned the favor. This kind of system requires maintenance. Relationships must be tended. Trust must be reinforced. Ritual likely played a role here. Ceremonies reaffirm shared values. They remind people of their place within a larger whole. They stabilize societies, not through fear, but through meaning. Leadership within Carl was probably subtle. There are no thrones to point to, no palaces towering above the rest. But organization on this scale does not happen accidentally. Someone coordinated labor, someone mediated disputes, someone decided when to build, where to build, how to allocate resources. This leadership may have been spiritual, administrative, or both. It likely relied on consensus more than command, and that requires a different kind of authority, one that persuades rather than compels. The city's decline does not erase its success. If anything, it reinforces it. Carol lasted long enough to adapt, to thrive, to influence others. When conditions shifted beyond what adaptation could manage, the response was not violence, it was movement. People left. They sought stability elsewhere. They carried knowledge with them, irrigation techniques, building methods, trade relationships. These did not vanish, they transformed. Carl may have emptied, but its ideas traveled. The desert preserved what remained. Sand is a strange archivist. It erases detail but protects structure. It softens edges but preserves form. And so the pyramids waited. When they were uncovered, again, the stones had not changed. But we had. The questions we asked were different. We were prepared to recognize complexity without spectacle. We were ready to accept that civilization has many forms. Cal stands now not as a curiosity, but as a correction. It reminds us that history is not a straight line of increasing violence and domination. It branches, it experiments. Some paths burn brightly and briefly, others glow quietly for centuries. Carol chose quiet, and in doing so, it left behind something rare, a model of what is possible when cooperation is valued over conquest, when sound matters more than silence, when gathering is prioritized over division. The city does not demand admiration, it invites reflection. The stones do not shout, they wait, and in their patience, they tell a story that continues long after the last footstep faded from the plaza. The valley did not empty all at once, it thinned. That is how places like this end, not with a moment, but with a process. One household leaves, then another. Then seasons pass, and no one repairs a wall. No, one clears a channel. No one lights the fires atop the platforms. The city does not notice at first. Stone does not feel absence the way people do. The pyramids remain, the plazas still wait, but the rhythm changes. And rhythm was everything here. With fewer voices, the music grows rare. With fewer gatherings, the rituals lose their cadence. What once tied the people together loosens, thread by thread. The river still flows, but it is less forgiving than before. Seasons arrive that test the fields. Crops struggle, trade slows, not because anyone wills it to, but because balance has shifted. Every system depends on pressure staying within limits. When it tips too far, the system does not explode, it slides. The people of Caral had always adapted. They had lived in negotiation with their environment for generations. But adaptation has a cost. It requires energy. And when returns diminish, choices narrow. Staying becomes harder than leaving. And so movement begins, not as exile, not as panic, but as decision. Families pack what matters: tools, instruments, knowledge. Children grow up walking away from plazas their parents once filled. They do not mourn a fallen city, they remember a living one. And memory travels more easily than stone. The routes outward become familiar. Paths along the river, paths toward the coast, paths into neighboring valleys. Cotton knowledge travels. Fishing net techniques move with people. Music follows. The sound of flutes does not belong to one place, it belongs to the hands that carve and play them. In this way, Caral does not disappear, it disperses. Its influence thins into the wider region, absorbed into new communities that will never know its full shape but will carry its habits. Irrigation channels elsewhere echo its logic. Plazas in distant settlements mirror its form, not copied exactly, but remembered imperfectly. And that is how culture persists, not intact, but alive. Back in the valley, the desert continues its slow work. Sand fills low spaces first. The sunken plazas soften. Round edges become softer. Still, staircases lose definition, step by step. The pyramids remain longest. They always do. They were built for patience. Stone absorbs heat by day and releases it by night. It cracks slowly. Mud hardens, then erodes, then hardens again. The structures change, but they do not vanish. They become quieter. Without voices, without footsteps, without drums, the city becomes a shape rather than a place, an arrangement of forms under the sky, an answer waiting for a question. Time stretches. This stretch is vast, enough that stories stop reaching it. No one points to the valley and says, there was once a city here. Children are not warned to avoid sacred ground. Travelers see only hills. They walk past without pause. The desert rewards indifference by hiding what it holds. And so Caral waits. The stars still pass overhead in the same patterns the builders once watched. Solstices come and go unnoticed. The pyramids still align, but no one marks the moment. Shadows fall where they always have. They just fall alone. The city exists in a state between being and forgetting, not destroyed, not remembered, just present. When the wind moves through the valley, it traces the old paths. It slips into corners where people once stood. It hums softly against stone that was shaped to catch sound. And in those moments, the design still works. The space still knows what it was built to do. Even without an audience, the city holds its breath. The materials used here tell their own story. Reed bags filled with stone remain packed inside the pyramids. These flexible layers still absorb movement when the earth shifts. The builders did not know the word earthquake engineering, but they understood the ground. They understood that rigidity breaks and flexibility survives. This knowledge was earned, not taught. It came from paying attention, from watching walls fail and adjusting quietly next time. The canals, though filled with sand, still trace the logic of water. They curve gently. They follow slopes that make sense. If cleared, they would flow again. That is the thing about Kara. Nothing here feels accidental. Every choice suggests deliberation. Every structure implies conversation across generations. This was not a society rushing toward greatness. It was one settling into it, and that makes its disappearance feel less like failure and more like completion. When the city had served its purpose, when the conditions that sustained it no longer held, it loosened its grip and let go. The artifacts left behind are humble. There's no hoarded wealth, no desperate caches hidden beneath floors. The objects found speak of daily life, fragments of textile, tools worn smooth by use, instruments shaped to be held comfortably. These were not the belongings of people expecting catastrophe. They were the traces of people who expected continuity. And that expectation carried them far beyond the valley itself. The absence of violence remains the most unsettling feature. It challenges assumptions deeply embedded in how power is usually understood. Here was complexity without coercion, scale without slaughter, organization without armies. This does not mean conflict never existed. It means it was managed differently. Disputes were likely resolved through ritual, through mediation, through social pressure rather than force. The plazas themselves may have played a role in this. Open spaces encourage visibility. Visibility encourages accountability. In a place where everyone gathers, behavior matters. You cannot hide easily in a circle. This design choice shapes culture. The very form of the city nudged its people toward cooperation. Architecture here was social engineering in the quietest sense. It guided movement, gathering, focus. It reinforced shared experience again and again until shared experience became identity. When people think of themselves as part of a whole, violence becomes costly, not morally alone, but practically. You break the system, you break yourself. Kara's builders seem to understand this instinctively. Their greatest monument was not a pyramid, it was a pattern, a way of living that balanced need and restraint, a system that allowed individuals to contribute without being erased. That kind of system is fragile, but while it holds, it is powerful. The long sleep of Caral does not erase this power. It preserves it in outline. When the city is uncovered again, its shape speaks before any artifact is examined. The plazas announce intention, the pyramids declare planning, the absence of fortification raises questions, and those questions linger. The city refuses to be categorized easily. It does not fit neatly into narratives built around conquest or collapse. It insists on another story, one that moves slower, one that ends without spectacle. As centuries pass, The valley continues to host life, though not in the same form. Small settlements appear and disappear along the river. People farm, fish, move on. They walk near the old mounds without knowing the depth. The stones remain patient. They have always been patient. That was their purpose. Not to impress, but to endure. Not to dominate, but to hold space. And space is what Carol understood better than most. Space for gathering, space for sound, space for time. The city was built with an awareness that human life is brief, but patterns can last. When people leave, the pattern remains faintly visible. The desert softens it, but does not erase it entirely. This is not a loop. This is a progression. A city forms, it thrives, it disperses. And what remains is not absence, but imprint. The imprint waits quietly for recognition. When eyes finally return to the valley with questions rather than indifference, the stones answer. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. They say that long before empires measured success by territory or force, there were people who measured it by balance, by rhythm, by the ability to live together without tearing the land or each other apart. They say that civilization can rise without shouting, and that sometimes the most enduring legacies are the ones that know when to step aside and let the desert breathe. The valley settles into a new rhythm, one without crowds or ceremony, but still shaped by what came before. The river does not forget its course. It still cuts through the land as it always has, quietly marking seasons. The fields that once drank from its channels grow wild or dry depending on the year. Some are claimed again briefly, then released. The knowledge of how to guide water does not vanish, it moves imperfectly remembered, adapted to new places. The people who left Carol did not abandon understanding. They carried it in habit, in gesture, in the way they watched the sky before planting. They carried it in the way they gathered, even when their gatherings were smaller now. The city's absence does not mean emptiness, it means diffusion. What was once concentrated spreads thin like seeds scattered wide. Some take root, others do not. That is how landscapes change. The pyramids continue to stand, though their purpose shifts. Without ritual, they become markers. Orientation, points. Travelers may use them unconsciously, adjusting their path by their silhouettes. They cast shadows long and steady, tracking time even when no one marks it. The sun still rises where it always has. Stone meets light at the same angles. The alignment holds. The builders anticipated this. They built for a future they would never see. They built knowing the city might one day belong to silence. The materials were chosen with this in mind: flexible fills, absorbent layers, structures that could breathe with the land rather than resist it. This patience was not accidental, it was learned. There were likely failures before success, walls that cracked, plazas that flooded, channels that eroded. Each mistake taught something, each correction was remembered, and memory here was communal. It lived in practice rather than record. That made it resilient but also vulnerable. When people leave, practice weakens. When practice weakens, knowledge thins. And yet, enough remained to echo elsewhere. In neighboring valleys, settlements rose that shared familiar shapes, plazas that curved inward, pyramidal platforms that served gathering rather than burial. These were not replicas, they were adaptations. The idea mattered more than the form. That idea was simple but rare, that people function best when they gather. That sound can unify, that shared rhythm can replace force. This idea does not always survive contact with scarcity. Scarcity pressures societies toward hierarchy, control, defense. Carroll resisted this longer than most. But resistance is not permanence. It is a balance maintained daily. When that balance tips, even slightly, the system must change. And so it did, quietly, without drama. The desert rewards this kind of ending. There are no charred remains to attract scavengers, no rubble to provoke curiosity. Sand smooths everything equally. It levels memory into shape. When wind moves across the valley, it does not discriminate. It brushes stone and sand the same way. The city becomes a part of the land rather than a mark upon it. This blending is complete enough that even those who pass close do not recognize what they see. The mounds look natural, the lines blur, and that, too, is a kind of success. Carroll does not fight the desert, even in abandonment. It yields gracefully. The long sleep that follows is not empty activity. It is full of slow change. Seismic shifts ripple beneath the ground. The pyramids settle incrementally. Their flexible cores absorb movement exactly as intended. This design choice continues to function long after its makers are gone. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing here. The city still works. It does what it was built to do even without users. It withstands, it aligns, it endures. The absence of people does not render it meaningless. It reveals the depth of its design. The soundscape changes. Without drums or flutes, the valley fills with wind. The wind moves differently through structured space. It curls into sunken plazas. It slides along staircases. It hums against stone edges shaped long ago. The acoustics remain. Even silence behaves differently here. The city holds sound, even when sound is absent. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is physical reality. Places remember through form. The longer Kara remains untouched, the more complete this memory becomes. There is no rebuilding to obscure it, no reuse to alter it. The city exists as it was left, frozen not in time but in intention. Each layer of sand that settles preserves rather than destroys. The reeds within the pyramids drive further, becoming lighter, stronger in their way. The stones press inward, locking more firmly. The desert hardens what it covers. Seasons pass unnoticed in human terms, but the city continues to measure them nonetheless. Shadows lengthen and shorten. Sunlight traces familiar paths. The stars still wheel overhead in patterns the builders once used to orient life. This continuity is not observed, but it exists. And existence does not require witness. The knowledge that once animated Cairo lives on elsewhere, but altered. Irrigation systems downstream echo its logic, but are simpler. Plazas in newer settlements gather fewer people. Music persists, but instruments change. Materials vary. The condobone flute becomes something else. The rhythm shifts, but the impulse remains, the need to gather, to mark time together, to align life with something larger than the individual. That impulse did not originate in Carroll, but Carroll refined it, and refinement leaves traces long after origin fades. The story does not circle back. The city does not return to prominence. It does not rise again under the same name. That is not how history moves. It flows forward, absorbing and discarding as needed. Kara's contribution becomes part of a broader, current, unrecognizable in isolation, but essential in some. The valley itself changes subtly over centuries. The river alters its course slightly, as rivers do. Fields that were once fertile silt over, then dry. Plants adapt, animals pass through. The pyramids remain landmarks even as their edges soften. They are never repurposed into fortresses. They are never crowned with new structures. They are left alone. This restraint is unusual. It suggests respect or perhaps simply distance. New communities find other places to anchor themselves. They do not override the old, they move beside it. This coexistence without conflict mirrors Corral's original approach. It negotiated space rather than seized it. And that ethic seems to persist even after the city's dispersal. When the valley is eventually approached with curiosity rather than indifference, the stones speak in their own way. They do not offer spectacle, they offer coherence. The layout makes sense. The choices align. The absence of violence stands out even more starkly against broader patterns seen elsewhere. Carol becomes evidence that another path was taken and that it worked for a long time. The city does not claim perfection. It shows fragility openly. It shows that balance requires constant effort and that even the best systems eventually yield to change. But it also shows that yielding does not equal failure. It can be a form of wisdom. The builders did not attempt to freeze the world. They adapted to it until adaptation no longer served. They did not scar the land in departure. They did not burn what they could not keep. They left space. This respect echoes forward. The desert holds the city gently, as it holds all things eventually. There is no triumph here, no tragedy, no lesson carved explicitly into stone. There is simply a pattern revealed. A society emerges in unlikely conditions. It organizes around cooperation. It builds with patience. It aligns with natural cycles. It disperses when those cycles shift beyond tolerance, and what remains is not ruin, but imprint. The imprint waits. It does not demand attention. It accepts it when it comes. This quiet persistence may be Carol's most enduring feature, not its size, not its age, but its refusal to shout, its willingness to exist fully and then step back. That is rare in human history, and that rarity is what allows its stones to speak across time without raising their voice. Time continues its quiet work. The valley does not resist it. Nothing here does. The river shifts again, not dramatically, just enough to redraw its edges. The old channels fill more completely now. Sediment, settling where water once moved with purpose. The logic of the system is still visible beneath the sand, a memory pressed into the ground. The land remembers even when people do not. Rain comes rarely, but when it does, the water briefly traces the ancient paths flowing where hands once guided it. This fleeting return is not enough to restore fields, but it is enough to reveal intention. The earth responds to old design as if it recognizes it. The pyramids weather further, their outlines soften, but their mass remains. Their placement continues to organize space, even in emptiness. Birds nest along ledges where people once stood. They use the height without knowing why it exists. Animals pass through plazas, following the easiest routes. The sunken spaces still draw movement inward. This is how design persists. It shapes behavior long after its makers are gone. The city becomes part of the ecosystem rather than an intrusion into it. This transition is slow and complete. Carol does not haunt the valley. it integrates with it. The silence deepens, but it is not absence. It is accumulation. The weight of years presses gently on stone. The wind polishes edges. The sand insulates rather than erodes. The desert is not purely destructive. It preserves through stillness. The absence of rain limits decay. Organic materials dry, harden. Textiles buried in sealed spaces survive far longer than expected. The reed filled cores of pyramids remain intact, protected by their own design. These structures were never meant to resist time aggressively, they were meant to move with it. And so they do. The knowledge that once animated the city continues elsewhere, but it evolves, it merges with other traditions, other rhythms, other priorities. Some communities retain the emphasis on gathering and ritual, others drift toward hierarchy and control. The Carroll way is not universal. It is one path among many, but it leaves a faint trace wherever it touched. The idea that power does not require violence does not vanish entirely. It surfaces in small ways, in customs, in conflict resolution, in the absence of fortifications in places where they might be expected. These absences are easy to miss. They do not announce themselves, but they matter. The valley itself becomes quieter still. Human passage grows infrequent. Seasons stretch into decades, decades into centuries. The city exists now mostly as a contour, a suggestion of form beneath the desert skin. It is not recognized as a city, not labeled as such. It simply is. The stars continue their slow patterns overhead. The same constellations rise and set, unchanged by what happens below. This continuity dwarfs human timelines, but it does not erase them. It contextualizes them. Carroll existed within this vastness briefly but deliberately. The builders understood scale. They built monuments large enough to matter, but not so large they defied their surroundings. They did not attempt to dominate the valley. They worked with it. This cooperation extended beyond construction into daily life. The absence of walls was not oversight, it was choice. The openness of the city reflects trust, or at least expectation, that conflict could be managed without enclosure. This expectation held for centuries. That alone challenges assumptions about early societies. It suggests that complexity does not inevitably lead to violence, it can lead to coordination instead. But coordination requires constant maintenance. It depends on shared values, shared rituals, shared understanding. When populations shift, when resources strain, that maintenance becomes harder. And so the system loosens, not abruptly, not catastrophically. It relaxes its hold and allows people to move on. This movement is not marked by ruin. There is no burned layer, no sign of destruction. The city simply stops being used, and stopping leaves fewer scars than ending. The desert prefers this kind of departure. It smooths what remains and preserves the rest. The memory of Carroll becomes geological rather than cultural. It is stored in layers rather than stories. This storage is remarkably stable. Layers do not exaggerate. They do not forget selectively. They hold what is placed within them and wait. The waiting lasts a long time. During this time, other societies rise and fall. Elsewhere, the valley remains peripheral to those movements. It does not become a center again. It remains quiet, observant, unchanging in its role as keeper rather than actor. The pyramids continue to cast shadows that mark time without measuring it. No one counts the days. No one tracks the solstices. But the alignments persist. This persistence is not mystical, it is mechanical. It is the result of careful planning and understanding of movement that does not depend on belief function. The city was built on observation more than doctrine. That is why it still works. The plazas remain acoustically active. Sound would carry here if there were sound to carry. The curved walls still guide vibration. The spaces still invite gathering. Even empty, they suggest use. They are incomplete without people, but not meaningless. This suggestion is subtle. It does not demand fulfillment. It simply exists. The land around the city slowly reclaims certain areas. Plants root where sediment accumulates, small shrubs appear, then disappear. Animals disturb the surface, but do not penetrate deeply. The buried layers remain sealed. This sealing protects fragile materials. Textiles, instruments, tools, all remain where they were left, waiting without intention. This waiting is not anticipation, it is suspension. The objects do not expect discovery, they do not hope, they simply persist. The idea of discovery does not exist for them. Time passes without narrative. When eventually the stones are uncovered again, the city will appear to awaken. But this awakening is an illusion. Carol never slept in the way living things sleep. It simply continued existing without participation. The patterns remained intact, ready to be read. The absence of writing in the city means that interpretation relies entirely on form. Form does not lie easily, but it can be misunderstood. And yet, Carol's form is remarkably clear. The lack of weapons is not ambiguous. The absence of fortifications is not subtle. The emphasis on gathering spaces is unmistakable. These choices speak louder than inscriptions might. They suggest priorities. They reveal values enacted physically rather than declared. The city's planners embedded their worldview into stone and space. They trusted that this would be enough. They did not need records to justify themselves. They built the justification into daily life. That daily life is gone, but its framework remains visible. This visibility is what allows Carol to speak across time. It does not tell the story of conquest or collapse. It tells a story of balance achieved and then released. It shows that societies can end without violence. They can dissolve rather than shatter. This dissolution is quieter, but perhaps more instructive. It suggests that endurance does not require permanence. It requires adaptability and the humility to step aside when conditions change. The valley embodies this lesson without commentary. It holds the remains without judgment. It allows sand to settle gently. It allows stone to weather slowly. It does not rush the process. This patience mirrors the patience of the builders themselves. They worked over generations. They accepted that they would not see completion. They planned for continuity beyond their own lives. That continuity did not take the form they expected, but it existed nonetheless. The knowledge they cultivated traveled further than the city ever did. The influence exerted outlived the structures they built. This is not legacy in the sense of memory. It is legacy in the sense of function, the way water is guided, the way people gather, the way sound is used to unify rather than command. These functions persist wherever conditions allow. They are not named. They do not carry the label of origin, but they trace back to places like this. The valley remains still. The pyramids remain patient. The desert continues its work. This work does not erase meaning. It distills it. It strips away surface until only structure remains. And structure, when designed with care, endures longer than story. Carol's story is not told loudly. It does not demand attention. It waits quietly in stone and sand, confident that understanding, when it arrives, will not need embellishment. The valley grows older, the stones grow older, the distance between moments stretches until it is no longer measured in days or seasons, but in subtle shifts that only the land itself can register. The river adjusts, again slightly lower now, its voice softer against the banks. It no longer presses insistently toward the old channels, but it still acknowledges them when water runs high, brushing their edges as if remembering an old agreement. The fields that once surrounded the city have fully surrendered to sand and scrub, but the soil beneath them still carries traces of long care. It holds nutrients longer than untouched ground. It responds differently to rain. This difference is quiet, but it is real. The land has been altered permanently by long habitation, not damaged, but shaped. The people who once lived here did not exhaust it. They worked with it long enough to leave a gentle imprint. That imprint does not fade easily. The pyramids continue their slow transformation. Edges soften further. Stairways become suggestions rather than paths. But the core remains solid. The reed-filled layers still absorb stress. They were never meant to be seen. They were meant to function. And function does not require visibility. This hidden intelligence is one of Carl's most consistent traits. What mattered most was often concealed. Structural choices buried beneath ceremonial surfaces. Social agreements embedded in architecture rather than law. This preference for quiet effectiveness over display defined the city from the beginning. It defines its remains as well. The plazas collect wind now, their shapes guided into slow spirals, drawing it downward, then releasing it gently. This movement keeps sand from piling too deeply in their centers. They resist burial longer than the surrounding ground. This resistance is not dramatic. It is just enough to preserve form. When animals pass through, their paths curve naturally toward these spaces. They linger briefly, then move on. The city continues to organize movement even without intention. This is design functioning independently of culture. Time presses on. The layers above the city thicken. The memory of its surface becomes increasingly abstract. Even the notion that this place was once inhabited fades entirely from human awareness. The valley exists as landscape alone, a place of quiet passage rather than destination. This anonymity protects it. There is no incentive to disturb what appears unremarkable. The desert rewards this neglect by keeping what it covers intact. This is not kindness, it is indifference, and indifference can be preservative. The objects left behind remain where they fell. They do not migrate. They do not accumulate. They wait. The instruments, once played regularly, now lie silent, but their forms remain clear. The holes drilled precisely, the surfaces smoothed by hands long gone. These details are intimate. They suggest touch. They suggest routine. They suggest evenings filled with sound rather than urgency. The absence of written record means these suggestions are all that remain, and they are enough. They convey a sense of life lived steadily rather than dramatically. The tools show wear, but not desperation. The textiles show care, but not excess. The scale of everything suggests sufficiency rather than accumulation. This was not a place of hoarding, it was a place of circulation. Resources moved through rather than pulled. This movement reduced inequality. It prevented stagnation. It required trust. And trust, once established, can sustain complexity without force. But trust is fragile. It depends on shared experience. Shared experience depends on proximity and continuity. When those fray, the system loosens. The city responded by dispersing rather than constricting. This choice avoided collapse. It avoided violence. It avoided the scars that draw attention centuries later. The result is a sight that whispers rather than shouts. This whisper persists across time because it does not provoke reaction, it simply exists. The valley itself changes character subtly over long spans. The desert expands and contracts within narrow limits. Plant species shift, animal roots adjust. None of this threatens the buried city. It rests below the zone of frequent disturbance. This depth was not accidental. The builders placed important structures where they would be least affected by surface volatility. They anticipated change. They planned for uncertainty. This planning extends their presence far beyond their departure. The city becomes less a place and more a condition, a configuration of choices frozen into matter. These choices reflect an understanding of limits, that land has limits, that people have limits, that systems must respect both to endure. The city did not aim to outgrow its environment. It aimed to fit it. That fitting was precise. It allowed growth without strain, but precision requires maintenance. When maintenance becomes unsustainable, the system must adapt again. This adaptation took the form of dispersal. The people became mobile. The ideas became portable. The structure stayed behind. This division allowed each element to continue in the way best suited to it. People move, stone waits. This separation was clean. It left little debris. It left little reason to return. The city's role was complete. As centuries continue to pass, the imprint deepens. The desert presses gently downward, locking layers together. The pyramids become more stable as they settle. Their mass distributes evenly. The flexible cores continue to do their work long after they are forgotten. This endurance is not heroic. It is practical. It reflects a worldview grounded in observation rather than ambition. The builders did not seek to defy time. They sought to accommodate it. That accommodation proves effective. The city survives not as monument, but as system preserved. The stars continue their cycles. The same patterns that once guided orientation still pass overhead. They are indifferent to what happens below, but their regularity provides a constant reference. The builders aligned their work to these movements, not out of reverence alone, but out of practicality. Seasonal cycles mattered, planting mattered, gathering mattered. The sky offered reliable signals, and reliability fosters calm. The city's rhythm mirrored this calm. It avoided extremes. It favored repetition over novelty. This preference made life predictable, and predictability reduces conflict. When people know what to expect, they plan, they negotiate, they adjust, they do not need to seize. The absence of fortification reflects this confidence, confidence born not of power, but of stability. When stability erodes, confidence fades. But Carol's stability eroded slowly, enough to allow graceful transition. This slow pace matters. It prevented shock. It prevented panic. It allowed knowledge to travel intact. The people who left did so with intention. They carried what they valued, they left what they could not move. This selectivity preserved essentials. The city did not drain itself dry, it redistributed itself. The valley then returned to quiet. This quiet deepened into centuries. The city's presence faded into geology. Its stones became part of the land story rather than humanity's. But land stories last longer. They are less easily forgotten. They are written in layers and shapes rather than words. When the city eventually re enters awareness, it will do so as an anomaly, a place that does not fit expected patterns, a society that grew large without sharpening itself into a weapon. This anomaly challenges assumptions, but it does so gently. It does not confront, it invites reconsideration. The absence of violence is not framed as virtue, it is simply fact. This matter of factness is disarming. It suggests that other paths were always possible. They were chosen here. They worked here for a long time. The city does not argue for imitation. It does not claim universality. It offers example, not a blueprint, but a precedent. Precedents do not demand repetition, they expand imagination. The valley continues its patient guardianship. It keeps the city intact without knowing it does so. The sand settles, the wind moves, the river flows, the pyramids hold, the plazas wait. This waiting is not anticipation, it is continuation. The city continues to exist in its chosen form, unused but not undone. The pattern remains legible for those who learn to read it, and reading does not require urgency, it requires stillness. That stillness has always been available here. The desert offers it freely. The city was built to meet it, and together they persist. Time does not stop. It rarely announces itself. It simply keeps pressing forward, layer after layer, season after season, until even memory becomes part of the landscape. In the valley, the river continues its long conversation with the land. Sometimes it swells, carrying silt and promise. Sometimes it shrinks, exposing cracked banks and silent stones. But always it moves, and always the valley adjusts. The old channels carved by careful hands still exist beneath the bent surface. They no longer guide water, but they influence how the ground absorbs it. When rare rains fall, the soil remembers where water once flowed. It drinks more deeply there. This memory of movement is another quiet legacy of the city. The absence of people does not mean the absence of order. Order remains embedded in the terrain. The pyramids settle further. They do not collapse. They compress. The weight of centuries presses inward, locking stones tighter. The reed-filled cores continue to flex imperceptibly, responding to tremors that pass through the earth. These tremors come and go. Some are strong enough to rearrange distant hills. Others are little more than whispers beneath the ground. But the structures respond as intended. They absorb, they release, they endure. This endurance is not accidental. It is the result of accumulated observation passed down through generations. Builders learned by watching walls crack and floors shift. They adjusted, they refined, they shared. This process took time, and time was something the city always seemed to have. The absence of urgency shaped everything. There was no race to outbuild a rival, no need to impress an enemy, no pressure to demonstrate dominance. The city grew because it was useful, because it worked, because it provided structure without strain. This practicality extended to social life as well. The plazas were large, but not overwhelming. They invited gathering without forcing it. Their sunken forms created intimacy even with large numbers. Sound traveled well, but not harshly. It blended. It wrapped around listeners rather than striking them. This acoustic softness mirrored the social tone. Rituals were participatory rather than theatrical. They emphasized inclusion rather than spectacle. Music filled space without overpowering it. The instruments tuned to complement one another rather than compete. This balance mattered. It reinforced cooperation. It reduced hierarchy. When leadership appeared, it did so quietly. Coordinators rather than commanders, organizers rather than conquerors. Authority flowed from function rather than fear. This arrangement required constant reinforcement through shared activity, shared labor, shared ceremony, shared meals. These practices bound people together more effectively than force ever could. But such systems rely on density. Proximity matters. When people begin to disperse, the reinforcement weakens. This weakening does not immediately cause collapse. It causes thinning. The web stretches, the threads lengthen, they remain connected, but the tension changes. This change is subtle. It manifests as longer travel, times, delayed exchanges, reduced frequency of gatherings. None of this feels catastrophic. It feels manageable until it isn't. The environment plays its part. The river cycles become less predictable. The timing of floods shifts slightly. Seasons blur at the edges. Crops respond with smaller yields. The cotton still grows, but not as abundantly. The surplus shrinks. Trade continues, but the margins narrow. Exchanges become more careful, more deliberate. There's less room for error. This increased precision demands more coordination. But coordination requires energy. Energy requires confidence. Confidence wanes when outcomes become uncertain. The people respond not with conflict, but with adjustment. They reduce scale. They focus on essentials. They prioritize portability. The city begins to empty slowly. This emptying is not abandonment, it is redistribution. Households relocate closer to more reliable water sources. Groups split and resettle along familiar routes. They maintain contact for a time. They share news. They exchange goods. But distance accumulates. It always does. Eventually, the city's central role diminishes. It becomes a place of origin rather than destination. People speak of it in terms of ancestry rather than residence. This shift changes how it is maintained. Rituals become less frequent. Structures receive less attention. Small repairs go undone, not because of neglect, but because of practicality. Resources are finite. They must follow people. The city accepts this withdrawal without resistance. It does not demand upkeep to remain meaningful. Its meaning has already been transferred into memory and practice. The physical form is no longer essential. This acceptance is crucial. It allows departure without guilt. It allows continuity without attachment. The city becomes quiet, not abruptly, not dramatically, just steadily. The last fires burn out on the platforms. The last gatherings disperse from the plazas. Footsteps fade. The wind takes over. The desert resumes its slow work of covering and smoothing. This work is patient. It does not erase. It preserves by burial. The instruments left behind are covered gently. The textiles decay, but their patterns imprint faintly into the soil. The wooden elements disappear, but their absence creates voids that fill with fine sediment. recording their shape in negative. This record is fragile, but it lasts long enough to be sealed beneath further layers. The city transitions from lived space to archive. This archive is not organized for easy access. It requires careful attention to read, but everything needed is there. The layout, the materials, the wear patterns, they speak of daily life rather than singular events. There are no signs panic, no evidence of hurried departure. Objects are placed where they were used. This placement suggests intention. People left when they could afford to. They chose timing rather than reacting to disaster. This choice preserved dignity. It preserved cohesion. It prevented the trauma that fractures societies. The city's story ends not with destruction, but with dispersal. This ending lacks drama, but it offers longevity. The people carry their knowledge elsewhere. They adapt it to new contexts. They modify it as needed, but the core principles persist: cooperation, trade, observation of natural cycles, respect for limits. These principles do not require monuments to survive. They live in practice. The city's physical remains become a reference point rather than a foundation. They anchor memory without demanding return. Centuries pass. The valley changes, but slowly. The city remains beneath the surface, stable and intact. The absence of disturbance allows preservation to continue. The structures remain aligned. The plazas retain their geometry. The pyramids hold their form. This persistence creates a time capsule, not frozen, but gently stabilized. The desert acts as curator, maintaining conditions favorable to long-term survival. It shields the city from erosion, from vegetation, from reuse. This shielding is accidental but effective. The city waits, not with intention, but with inevitability. It exists until it is encountered again. When that encounter happens, it will not feel like discovery so much as recognition. The shapes will feel purposeful, the layout intelligible, the materials familiar, the absence of violence striking. The city will challenge assumptions quietly. It will suggest that complexity does not require cruelty, that scale does not demand hierarchy. That stability can emerge from cooperation rather than coercion. But for now, it remains silent. The wind continues to pass through shallow depressions that were once plazas. It follows curves designed long ago. It moves as it always has. The stones remain. The sand settles. The valley holds. The city rests exactly where it was left, complete in its incompletion, enduring in its stillness. The land continues to breathe in its slow way. The valley does not rush toward change. It accepts it grain by grain. Season after season, the desert presses closer, not as an enemy, but as a patient presence. It fills low places. It smooths sharp edges. It quiets contrast. The city beneath responds by settling further into itself. The weight above compresses what was already strong. The stones knit tighter. The spaces between them grow smaller. The structures become less vulnerable with every passing year. This is the paradox of burial. It weakens surfaces but strengthens cores. What was built to last learns how to endure absence. The river keeps moving. Its path wanders slightly over generations, but it never forgets the valley. It feeds other fields now. Other communities rely on it. The knowledge carried outward from the city adapts to new soils and rhythms. People build smaller, they build differently, but echoes remain. The way channels are angled, the way foundations are layered, the way communal spaces are shaped to gather sound and shade. These choices reappear in distant places, altered but recognizable. The city dissolves into influence rather than rubble. This diffusion is quiet. It leaves no obvious origin point, but it binds regions together through shared habits, shared solutions, shared understandings of land and limit. The valley where the city rests becomes a reference without being referenced. Its presence informs without instructing. The animals that pass through adapt to the subtle contours left behind. They follow depressions that once guided people. They shelter briefly in the lee of mounds that were once platforms. The city continues to organize life indirectly. This indirect influence is perhaps its most lasting achievement. It shaped behavior without enforcement. It shaped movement without walls. It shaped time without clocks. This shaping persists because it aligns with natural tendencies rather than opposing them. The land favors paths of least resistance. The city provided those paths, and the land kept them. The sky continues its cycles. The stars rise and fall along familiar arcs. The same alignments that once marked seasons still occur. The stones below are still oriented correctly. They do not need observers to function. They mark time regardless. This marking becomes redundant without ritual, but redundancy does not negate accuracy. It simply reduces relevance. The city's relevance fades, but its correctness does not. This distinction matters. It allows the site to remain intact rather than be repurposed. When places lose relevance but retain integrity, they are left alone. This aloneness is protective. The desert rewards it by maintaining equilibrium. The city exists in a long pause. This pause stretches across generations beyond counting. It becomes a feature of the valley rather than an event in history. Events require witnesses. Features simply persist. The city becomes feature like. It is neither ruin nor monument. It is structure embedded in land. The materials continue their slow interactions. Mud dries further. Stone weathers minimally. Reeds long since decayed leave impressions that harden into absence. These absences tell stories too. They reveal what was once flexible, what once moved, what once absorbed stress. The city's builders understood flexibility. They valued it. They built with materials that could give rather than crack. This philosophy extended beyond architecture. It shaped social arrangements. It allowed adaptation without fracture. That same flexibility allows the remains to endure. The city does not insist on being seen. It does not rise dramatically above the sand. It allows itself to be covered. This humility is structural. It is not symbolic. It is practical. It prevents erosion. It discourages disturbance. It ensures survival. The valley remains quiet. The passage of time is marked only by subtle shifts. Light falls differently as surfaces change. Shape influences shadow. Shadow influences temperature. Temperature influences movement. These chains of cause and effect continue uninterrupted. The city participates passively. It shapes microclimates. It alters airflow. It influences where dew settles at night. These small effects accumulate. They create slightly different conditions over the buried structures. This difference preserves outlines beneath the surface. It keeps edges crisp enough to be legible when uncovered. The city waits within these conditions. It does not deteriorate evenly. Some areas remain remarkably intact. Others soften more quickly. This unevenness reflects original use. Areas of heavy traffic compacted more firmly. Areas of ritual attention received better maintenance. These patterns freeze into the archaeological record long before anyone considers reading it. The record is not created intentionally. It is a byproduct of living carefully. The people did not plan to be remembered. They planned to function. Remembrance emerges as consequence rather than goal. This distinction separates the city from many others, built around assertion and display. The city does not shout its importance, it demonstrates it quietly through coherence. This coherence remains visible even after long absence. The layout still makes sense. The relationships between spaces remain logical. The flow from one area to another feels intentional. This intelligibility persists because it was grounded in daily life rather than abstract power. The city's design responded to needs that remain universal: shelter, gathering, movement, orientation. These needs do not change quickly. The solutions that address them here remain understandable across time. The city communicates across centuries without words. It uses proportion, alignment, material choice. These are languages that persist. The valley holds this message without interpreting it. It does not care about meaning, it cares about balance. And the city maintains balance even in absence. This maintenance allows time to pass without destruction. The longer time passes, the more the city becomes part of the valley's baseline state. It is no longer an intrusion, it is a ingredient. The sand above it behaves differently because of what lies below. The plants that occasionally take root grow differently. Their roots encounter compacted layers and adjust. This adjustment influences growth patterns. The city shapes life long after its own life has ended. This shaping is subtle but measurable. It alters the valley's ecology in small ways. These ways accumulate into difference. The valley with the city is not the same as the valley without it. This difference persists even when unseen. The city's influence extends beyond its boundaries as well. The knowledge carried outward by its people continues to adapt and reappear in new forms. This diffusion blurs origin but preserves essence. It creates a cultural field rather than a single center. This field supports resilience. It prevents overconcentration. It allows societies to shift without collapsing entirely. The city's dispersal contributes to this resilience. It avoids the brittle failure that comes from excessive centralization. This avoidance is not framed as strategy. It emerges naturally from values that prioritize balance and sufficiency. The city's story, therefore, does not end. It transforms. It moves from place to practice, from stone to habit, from architecture to expectation. This transformation, gradual, it lacks punctuation. There is no final moment, no closing ritual, no last word. The city simply becomes something else. The valley continues, the river continues, the sky continues. The stones remain where they are, holding form, holding memory, holding nothing at all. And this holding is enough. The silence deepens, but it is never empty. It is filled with slow processes unfolding beneath the surface. The city remains exactly where it settled, its presence now fully absorbed into the valley's long rhythm. The desert does not erase. It layers. It adds weight carefully, evenly, as if sealing something valuable rather than discarding it. The stones beneath respond with patience. They were shaped for pressure. They accept it. They grow more stable with time. The angles hold. The foundations distribute weight outward and downward, spreading stress until it becomes harmless. This was understood long before the last footsteps faded. The builders trusted time. They trusted the land. They trusted that if something was made correctly, it did not need constant attention to survive. This trust is rewarded. The city endures without guardians. The river continues to follow its course. It no longer feeds the city, but it still defines the valley. The seasonal floods come and go. They deposit fine layers, silt far from the buried structures. The city remains dry and protected, its elevation just high enough to avoid saturation. This placement was deliberate. The builders chose safety over convenience. They accepted longer walks to water in exchange for permanence. This choice matters now more than ever. It keeps the city intact while the surrounding land shifts and settles. The winds continue to trace familiar paths. They funnel through shallow depressions and curve around low mounds. These movements were shaped long ago by walls and platforms. They persist because the underlying geometry persists. The city still guides the air, still shapes sound, still moderates temperature. This quiet influence continues uninterrupted. The animals that cross the valley respond instinctively. They follow paths that feel natural. They avoid areas that feel unstable. The buried city feels solid beneath their feet. They pause, they rest, they move on. This behavior reinforces the preservation process. It keeps traffic light. It prevents disturbance. The city remains undisturbed because it remains useful in small ways. The sky above cycles endlessly. The same stars rise in the same order. The same solstices return with predictable regularity. The alignments below remain accurate. They do not drift. They do not decay. This accuracy is a testament, careful observation, and long calibration. The builders did not guess. They watched. They adjusted. They refined over generations. This refinement produced results that last beyond their own lives. The city continues to mark time without announcing it. It offers orientation without instruction. This quiet precision reflects a worldview that valued consistency over spectacle. The city was never meant to surprise, it was meant to support. And support does not need attention to function. The absence of dramatic collapse allows the story to stretch smoothly across centuries. There are no interruptions, no scars that force reinterpretation. The narrative remains continuous, even as it becomes increasingly abstract. The city transitions from lived environment to latent structure. It becomes part of the valley's memory rather than its present. But memory does not require consciousness to persist. It can exist in form and pattern. The city's memory is stored in alignment, in material choice, in spatial relationships. These elements remain readable long after voices gone. The land keeps this memory intact by refusing to disturb it. The desert's dryness slows decay. The lack of vegetation prevents roots from breaking stone. The scarcity of water limits chemical erosion. These conditions combine to create preservation without intention. The city benefits from neglect. This neglect is total. No one tends, no one repairs, but no one destroys either. This balance allows the city to exist in a suspended state, neither alive nor ruined. The centuries continue to accumulate, the layers above thicken, the outlines below remain clear. The city becomes harder to access but easier to preserve. This trade-off favors longevity. The deeper the burial, the safer the structures. The builders could not have predicted this outcome precisely, but they understood enough to make it possible. They chose materials and methods suited to long-term stability. They avoided reliance on perishable elements where permanence mattered. They accepted impermanence where it did not. This selective approach optimized survival. The city's story remains consistent throughout this long pause. There is no reversal, no resurgence, no sudden return. It stays exactly what it became after dispersal, a complete system at rest. This rest is not failure, it is conclusion. The city accomplished what it was meant to accomplish. It supported life, it organized cooperation, it balanced environment, society. When those conditions changed, it allowed transition without resistance. This acceptance prevented damage. It preserved integrity. The valley now holds a finished work rather than a broken one. This finished state is subtle. It does not announce completion. It simply ceases to change in meaningful ways. The city becomes stable. The processes that once defined daily life are replaced by geological ones. These processes are slower, but they follow predictable patterns. The city adapts to them as it adapted to everything else. It yields where necessary, it holds where possible. This adaptability continues even without people. The stones respond to pressure, the layout responds to erosion, the materials respond to temperature shifts. These responses are passive but effective. The city remains coherent. The coherence is its final gift. It allows future understanding. It ensures that when the city is eventually encountered again, it will be legible. It will speak clearly through form rather than narrative. It will not require reconstruction or imagination to comprehend. Its logic will be visible, its priorities evident, its values embedded in space rather than text. The city waits within this coherence. It does not anticipate recognition. It does not require validation. It exists because it was built well and left gently. This combination is rare. It allows endurance without distortion. The valley continues its quiet work. The desert remains steady. The river flows. The sky turns. The city rests, complete and unchanged. Its long silence uninterrupted. Its story intact. Within the earth, the centuries continue to slide past one another without friction. The valley accepts them as it accepts everything else, without ceremony, without record. The city beneath remains unchanged in purpose, even as its meaning dissolves into something broader and less defined. It is no longer a place where people live. It becomes a place where time settles. The stones hold still while everything else moves around them. The stillness is not passive, it is active endurance. The materials respond constantly to pressure, temperature, and the slow breathing of the earth. They do not resist, they cooperate. This cooperation was learned long ago when the city was alive. The builders learned it from the land itself. They copied what endured. They avoided what fractured. They paid attention. The result is a city that continues to behave correctly even without instruction. The river shifts again, slightly farther from the old heart of the valley. It does not abandon it entirely. It never does, but its closeness fades. The old irrigation channels dry completely. They become indistinguishable from the surrounding soil except to the ground itself. The soil remembers where water once passed. It compacts differently. It erodes differently. This memory remains long after the channels vanish from sight. The city's agricultural legacy persists invisibly. The land continues to respond as if cultivation might resume at any moment. This readiness is a form of preservation. It keeps the soil receptive rather than exhausted. The absence of exploitation allowed recovery without loss. This restraint defined the city's relationship with its environment from the beginning. It continues to define the valley long after the people are gone. The winds grow stronger in some seasons, weaker in others. They test the exposed surfaces. They move sand in thin sheets. The city's buried forms guide this movement. They create subtle ridges and hollows that influence deposition. These influences accumulate over time. They shape the surface into gentle undulations that mirror what lies below. This mirroring is not exact, but it is suggestive. The land carries the city's outline like a faint echo. This echo is enough to maintain separation between natural formations and those shaped by intention. The city remains legible in the way the desert moves around it. This legibility persists without being obvious. It waits for attention that may never come. The animals continue their quiet interactions. They graze where the soil is slightly richer. They avoid places where stone lies too close to the surface. These preferences reinforce preservation. The city's most delicate areas remain lightly trafficked. The heavier stone structures bear occasional weight without damage. The balance holds. The valley's ecology adjusts around the buried forms rather than disrupting them. This adjustment creates a stable equilibrium. The city becomes part of the valley's baseline state rather than an anomaly. The passage of generations elsewhere does not disturb this equilibrium. People move through the region from time to time. They travel along the river. They camp briefly. They pass on. They notice nothing unusual. The low mounds appear natural. Their shapes do not provoke curiosity. They blend into the broader landscape. This blending is another consequence of restraint. The city was never built to dominate the horizon. It rose enough to function, not enough to intimidate. This modesty now protects it. The structures do not draw attention. They do not invite reuse. They are left alone. This neglect is total and continuous. It allows preservation to proceed uninterrupted. The city remains untouched by cycles of destruction and rebuilding that erase so many other places. The sky continues its endless rotation. The same patterns repeat with mechanical precision. The city's alignments remain accurate. They do not drift. They do not lose relevance. They simply cease to be consulted. This cessation does not diminish their correctness. It only removes their social function. The stones still mark solstices. The shadows still fall where they always have. The knowledge embedded in these relationships remains intact, waiting quietly. The city's builders anticipated change. They did not expect permanence of population. They built for continuity of structure rather than continuity of use. This foresight allowed abandonment without ruin. The city does not decay into chaos. It settles into stillness. This stillness is the final stage of its life cycle. It is neither death nor dormancy. It is completion. The city has become what it was always moving toward, a stable configuration of matter aligned with natural forces. The cultural energy that once animated it has dispersed, but the physical intelligence remains. This intelligence is embedded in choices made long ago, choices about placement, materials, geometry. These choices continue to operate. They require no maintenance. They simply function. The valley benefits from this functioning even if it does not recognize it. The buried city moderates erosion. It stabilizes soil. It influences water flow during rare rains. These benefits are subtle but cumulative. They shape the valley's long-term behavior. The city continues to contribute long after it ceases to consume. This contribution is its quiet legacy. It gives without taking. It stabilizes without demanding. This asymmetry allows it to persist indefinitely. The absence of conflict in its history contributes to this persistence. There are no layers of destruction, no burned surfaces, no hastily rebuilt sections. The stratigraphy remains clean and orderly. This clarity preserves information. It prevents confusion. It allows the city's story to remain coherent across time. The land does not have to reconcile multiple contradictory phases. It holds a single, consistent narrative. This consistency is rare. It is a direct result of peaceful development and gentle dispersal. The city's end was not imposed, it was chosen. This choice preserved integrity. The valley now contains a complete example of a society that grew, thrived, and withdrew without violence. This example exists regardless of whether it is recognized. It remains available as reference. The city's presence continues to shape possibility even in absence. It demonstrates that complexity can emerge without coercion. That scale can be achieved without domination. That longevity can result from cooperation rather than conquest. These demonstrations are not proclaimed, they are embodied. The stones embody them, the layout embodies them, the absence of fortifications embodies them, the city's silence embodies them. The centuries continue, the city remains, the valley holds it gently, the earth presses down evenly. The structures respond as designed. The story does not loop, it moves steadily toward deeper stillness. The city's role is complete. It does not repeat itself. It does not seek renewal. It rests exactly as intended, unchanged, unbroken, its long, quiet stretching onward without interruption. The land grows heavier with years, but the weight is evenly shared. The city beneath does not strain. It was never built to resist time. It was built to move with it, and so it does quietly, patiently, without complaint. The desert continues its slow work of smoothing contrasts. Where once sharp lines defined steps and walls, there are now softened slopes. The geometry remains, but it is gentler, as if the land itself has learned the city's language and begun to speak it fluently. The pyramids are no longer distinct monuments. They are part of the valley's anatomy, ridges rather than structures, forms rather than statements. This transformation protects them. It allows them to persist without challenge. The city becomes invisible not because it disappears, but because it belongs. The river's voice changes subtly over long spans. Sometimes it sings louder, sometimes it whispers, but its path remains familiar. It still respects the contours shaped long ago. The old floodplains still absorb water differently. The soil still remembers where channels once guided flow. This memory influences vegetation during rare seasons of growth. Small plants take root more easily where the ground was once tended. They sprout briefly, then fade. This brief greening marks the city's footprint in fleeting color before returning to sand. These moments pass unnoticed. They do not last long enough to draw attention, but they are enough to reinforce preservation. They stabilize soil. They reduce erosion. They protect what lies beneath. The city continues to shape outcomes without intention. The stones beneath respond to the earth's movements with quiet efficiency. Tremors pass through the valley occasionally. They ripple outward from distant sources. The city absorbs them as designed. The layered cores flex. The wide foundations distribute force. The rounded edges deflect stress. There is no cracking, no collapse, no drama, just adjustment. This adjustment continues indefinitely. It does not degrade with age. It improves as materials settle and interlock. The city becomes stronger with time, not weaker. This strength is invisible. It does not assert itself. It simply exists. The absence of maintenance does not matter because maintenance was never the point. Correctness was. The builders achieved correctness through observation rather than theory. They tested methods. They refined them. They passed them down. This accumulation of practical knowledge is embedded in the city's bones. It cannot be lost unless the bones themselves are destroyed, and they are not. The desert protects them by ignoring them. The valley remains largely unchanged in its broader form. Hills erode slowly. The river meanders within limits. The climate fluctuates gently. These fluctuations never reach extremes that would threaten the buried city. The placement was chosen carefully, not at the valley's lowest point, not on unstable slopes, but on ground that offered balance. This balance holds. The city rests within it, secure. The sky continues its endless turning. The same constellations appear and vanish in predictable rhythms. The alignments below remain true. They mark these rhythms faithfully. They no longer guide ritual, but they still function as instruments. They still measure. They still orient. The city continues to keep time even though no one listens. This silent timekeeping adds another layer of stillness. The city is synchronized with the cosmos without participation. This synchronization reinforces stability. It locks the city into larger cycles that dwarf human timelines. This scale difference protects it from urgency. It exists on a slower register where change is gradual and manageable. The animals that pass through the valley continue to interact with the buried forms in small ways. They scratch against exposed stones. They rest on slightly raised ground. They dig shallow burrows that stop when they encounter compacted layers. These interactions do not harm the city. They reveal its presence only to those who know how to look. The city tolerates this contact. It was built to withstand human use. It can easily withstand this. The valley's silence deepens as centuries accumulate, not because sound disappears, but because nothing interrupts the background rhythm. The wind, the occasional water, the movement of life continue without variation. This consistency allows the city's story to remain linear. There are no reversals, no cycles of destruction, rebuilding, no phases of abandonment followed by reuse. The narrative moves steadily from habitation to stillness without looping back. This forward motion matters. It prevents confusion. It allows cause and effect to remain clear. The city's decline was not collapse. It was transition, and transitions do not repeat, they progress. The city's physical form reflects this progression. It moves from active use to passive presence to geological feature. Each stage builds upon the last. None negate what came before. The integrity remains intact. This integrity is visible in the way materials age uniformly. There are no mismatched repairs, no intrusive additions, no scars of conflict. The surfaces weather evenly. The buried layers compress uniformly. This uniformity preserves information. It keeps relationships clear. The city remains readable, even as it disappears. The valley continues to carry this information without interpreting it. It does not assign value, It does not preserve out of reverence, it preserves because conditions allow it to do so. This neutrality is powerful. It prevents distortion. The city is neither mythologized nor vilified. It simply is. The long silence continues to stretch. The city becomes older than memory, older than story, older than awareness, but not older than relevance. The principles embedded within it remain applicable even if unrecognized. They exist as potential. They wait within form rather than narrative. The city offers this potential without insisting upon it. This restraint is consistent with everything else it represents. The valley holds the city gently. The sand presses down evenly. The stones hold steady. The structures remain aligned. The story continues forward into deeper stillness without repeating itself, without turning back, without needing conclusion. The stillness grows thicker, but it never becomes stagnant. It is a living stillness, one that shifts so slowly it feels permanent. The city beneath has fully crossed into another state of existence. It no longer belongs to the time of people. It belongs to the time of land. And land measures everything differently. The stones do not count years. They respond to pressure. They respond to balance. They respond to gravity and heat and the slow settling of matter. This is their language now, and the city speaks it fluently. The desert above continues its careful layering. Sand moves in thin veils, never violently, never all at once. It settles into depressions. It smooths edges. It protects what it covers from exposure. The city benefits from this gentle burial. It becomes insulated from extremes. Temperature shifts soften. Moisture rarely reaches depth. The structures remain dry and stable. This protection is unintentional but complete. The desert has no agenda. It simply does what deserts do, and what it does happens to preserve. The river continues its distant work. It feeds other lands now, but it still defines the valley's identity. The valley remains a corridor rather than a destination. This transience discourages settlement. It keeps disturbance minimal. The buried city remains undisturbed because nothing demands its reuse. The valley offers no easy resources on the surface, no timber, no abundant water, no fertile fields visible at a glance. The effort required to dig or build anew discourages intrusion. This difficulty is another layer of protection. The city rests beneath it all, untouched. The sky remains constant in its cycles. The same stars pass overhead. The same rhythms repeat with unwavering precision. The city's orientation remains correct. It continues to mirror the sky even in silence. This alignment anchors the city within cosmic order rather than human chronology. It exists on a scale that dwarfs individual lives and even generations. This scale difference removes urgency. It allows patience to dominate. The city waits without waiting. It exists without expectation. The animals that cross the valley continue their quiet routines. They do not sense history. They sense stability. They move where ground feels firm. They avoid places where footing is uncertain. The buried structures provide firmness. They offer subtle guidance. This guidance influences paths over time. These paths reinforce preservation. They prevent random disturbance. They create predictable movement patterns that avoid sensitive areas. The city shapes behavior without presence. This influence persists because it aligns with instinct rather than instruction. The land itself participates in this preservation. The compacted layers resist erosion. They shed water efficiently during rare rains. They redirect flow around rather than through the buried structures. This redirection prevents washout. It maintains integrity. The builders anticipated water. They planned for it. They shaped surfaces and foundations to manage it. This planning continues to function long after use has ended. The city remains a working system even in stillness. The absence of people does not mean the absence of process. Process continues at a slower pace. The city adapts continuously to microscopic changes. Particles shift, minerals settle, stresses redistribute. These adjustments occur quietly. They never accumulate into failure. The structures were designed to accommodate such movement. They flex where needed. They hold where required. This balance remains effective indefinitely. The valley's climate fluctuates within narrow bounds. It never reaches extremes that would threaten the buried city. This moderation contributes to longevity. The placement of the city within the valley's microclimate was deliberate. It avoided flood zones. It avoided unstable slopes. It chose ground that offered consistency. This consistency persists. The city remains safe by design. The long passage of time does not introduce new threats. It only deepens stillness. The city's narrative continues forward without deviation. There are no interruptions, no returns, no rediscoveries within this timeline. The city simply continues to exist in its completed state. This completion is not finality, it is equilibrium. The city has reached a point where change no longer alters its essence. It may continue to soften, it may continue to settle, but its identity remains intact. The relationships between structures remain clear. The logic of the layout remains readable. The priorities of the builders remain evident. These qualities persist because they were grounded in fundamentals rather than trends. The city was not built to impress, it was built to function. Function endures when form follows necessity rather than ego. The valley continues to hold this example quietly. It does not announce it, it does not highlight it, it simply contains it. The desert remains patient, the river continues, the sky turns. The city rests, unchanging, unbroken, its long story moving steadily forward into deeper layers of time, never looping back, never repeating, only continuing. The valley carries on without awareness of how long it has been holding what lies beneath it. The city has fully merged with the earth's slower rhythms now. It is no longer something separate, resting inside the land. It has become part of the land's internal logic. The stones are no longer remembered as stones placed by hands. They are simply layers, compressed matter, shaped density. This transformation is gradual and irreversible. It does not erase intention, it absorbs it. The intentions that once guided construction now guide preservation. The desert continues to behave gently. The sand settles in thin, even sheets. It never piles abruptly. It never scours deeply. This gentleness is the desert's quiet discipline. It preserves by refusing extremes. The city benefits from this restraint. The structures remain buffered from surface change. They exist in a stable pocket beneath the shifting skin of the valley. The river remains distant but influential. Its presence still defines humidity, wind, patterns, and the slow migration of soil. The valley remains a corridor of movement rather than a destination. This movement passes over the buried city without engaging it. Travelers follow the water. They do not linger on the dry ground above the ruins. The city remains untouched, not because it is hidden perfectly, but because it does not invite attention. This lack of invitation was always part of its character. It was never ostentatious. It did not rise to dominate. It rose only enough to function. This functional scale now blends seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. The sky continues its endless sequence. The stars return again and again in precise order. The city's alignments remain correct. They still frame these movements accurately. They continue to mark transitions between seasons, even though no one gathers to observe them. This silent correspondence between stone and sky reinforces the sense that the city still participates in a larger order. It is no longer social, but it is still cosmic. This participation gives the city a kind of timelessness. It exists beyond relevance and obsolescence. It simply exists correctly. The animals of the valley continue to interact with the land instinctively. They sense firmness, they sense shelter, they respond to subtle variations in ground temperature and stability. The buried city creates these variations. The stone retains heat differently than sand. It cools differently at night. This difference influences where animals rest briefly before moving on. These brief pauses do not disturb the structures. They reinforce preservation by limiting random digging. The city remains intact because it aligns with instinct rather than opposing it. The land's internal processes continue uninterrupted. Minerals migrate slowly. Water vapor rises and falls. Tiny fractures form and seal again. The city's materials accommodate these movements. They were chosen for compatibility rather than dominance. Mud and stone work together. They expand and contract at similar rates. They share stress rather than transferring it unevenly. This compatibility prevents failure. The builders understood this intuitively. They selected materials that belong together. This belonging persists long after construction ends. The city's story continues forward without repetition. It does not cycle through phases of use and abandonment. It does not rise again. It does not decay into chaos. It remains exactly where it settled after dispersal. This steadiness prevents narrative loops. There is no return to earlier states. There is only deeper integration. The city becomes less distinct but more permanent as time advances. The valley itself becomes a record of this integration. The surface above the city behaves differently. The sand compacts more firmly. The contours hold shape longer. The wind patterns adjust. These differences are subtle, but they persist. They mark the city's presence without revealing it outright. This balance keeps the city safe. It is detectable only to those who look carefully. The long passage of time does not introduce new pressures. It only reinforces existing ones. The weight above increases slowly. The structures respond by settling further into equilibrium. The deeper they go, the more stable they become. The city's foundations were designed for this. They anticipated weight. They welcomed it. This welcoming of pressure is another reason for endurance. The city does not resist burial. It accepts it. The narrative remains calm throughout. There are no moments of crisis, no sudden change. The city's decline was resolved long ago. The remaining story is one of sustained stillness. This stillness is active. It is filled with ongoing processes, but none of them disrupt the whole. The city remains coherent. This coherence is the final outcome of careful planning and gentle dispersal. The valley continues to hold the city exactly as it was left. The desert remains patient. The river continues its distant work. The sky turns without interruption. The city rests within all of this, unchanging in essence, its long existence, continuing forward into silence, without looping back, without repetition without end. The land continues its slow negotiation with itself. The valley does not rush toward any conclusion. It allows each change to complete fully before the next begins. The buried city remains steady within this patience. It does not resist settling. It does not collapse inward. It holds its shape through quiet cooperation with gravity. The stones press downward. The earth presses upward. Between these forces, a balance forms. This balance is not static. It adjusts continuously, but so gradually that no single moment defines it. The city remains whole because nothing demands sudden movement. The climate maintains its narrow range. Days warm, nights cool, seasons shift with restraint. There are no violent interruptions. The ground dries evenly after rare moisture. The dryness protects organic remnants. It limits rot. It slows chemical reactions. This dryness is another unintentional safeguard. The city persists because conditions never accelerate decay. The builders selected this valley for that reason. They understood dryness, they understood stability, they understood that absence of abundance discourages intrusion. This understanding continues to prove correct. The valley remains quiet. The pathways that once connected plazas and platforms still exist as compressed corridors beneath the surface. These corridors influence how weight distributes above them. The ground does not sag randomly. It holds its form where structure remains beneath. This hidden architecture continues to shape the surface subtly. The land remembers the city even when it cannot be seen. This memory expresses itself through firmness and alignment rather than visibility. The city's internal spaces remain intact. Rooms remain rooms even when filled. They maintain their boundaries. They preserve voids where air once moved. These voids slowly compress, but never collapse suddenly. The compression happens evenly. This evenness prevents fracture. The city's form changes, but its logic remains legible. The materials continue to interact peacefully. Mud brick absorbs stress. Stone distributes weight. Fiber bindings, long since returned to soil, have left behind channels where movement once occurred. These channels guide moisture away. They prevent pooling. They continue to perform their function without awareness. The city operates as a passive system, still responding correctly to environmental input. This correctness is the key to endurance. Time continues forward without narrative escalation. There are no events that demand attention. The city does not experience rediscovery within this flow. It remains outside cycles, recognition. It exists independently of observation. This independence allows the story to remain linear. There is no return to beginnings. There is no reframing. The city simply continues deeper into its settled state. The valley around it continues to adjust subtly. The wind shapes dunes that never reach critical mass. The dunes migrate slowly. They pass over the buried structures without pressure. The weight they add distributes evenly. This distribution reinforces stability rather than threatening it. The city remains unaffected by surface movement. The deeper layers continue to insulate it from all but the most gradual changes. The river's distant presence still influences the underground water table. It rises and falls slightly, but never enough to saturate the buried city. This moderation prevents erosion. It preserves edges and angles. The city remains geometrically coherent. The precision of its layout persists because water never overwhelms it. The builders anticipated this. They selected elevation carefully. They aligned drainage paths thoughtfully. These decisions continue to pay dividends long after purpose has ended. The sky continues its reliable movement. The city's orientation remains meaningful even in silence. It still faces the same directions. It still aligns with solstices and equinoxes. These alignments do not require observers to remain valid. They are relationships rather than performances. The city remains connected to cycles larger than itself. This connection gives it permanence beyond utility. The animals continue to move across the valley. They avoid unstable ground instinctively. The buried city offers stability. This stability attracts brief pauses and crossings. These interactions remain light. They never involve digging or burrowing deep enough to disrupt structure. The city remains safe because it harmonizes instinctual behavior rather than provoking it. The soil above continues to compact slowly. This compaction reduces oxygen flow further. This reduction slows biological activity. The buried materials remain preserved in their dry, compressed environment. The city's decay slows to a near standstill. It does not vanish. It does not transform dramatically. It simply remains. This remaining is the final stage of its existence. The city has moved beyond use, beyond abandonment, and into continuity. This continuity does not loop. It does not repeat earlier phases. It does not reset. It moves only forward into deeper integration with the land. The narrative remains calm throughout. There are no climactic moments, no concluding gestures. The city's story is one of steady persistence. The valley continues to hold it. The desert continues to protect it. The river continues its distant influence. The sky continues its endless turning. The city rests within these forces, unshaken, unaltered in essence, carried forward quietly through time, without repetition, without interruption, without return. The slow weight of the earth continues to settle with quiet confidence. The valley does not change direction. It does not reconsider what it has accepted. The buried city remains folded into the ground like a completed thought that no longer needs revision. The stones press gently into the soil, and the soil responds by tightening its hold. This mutual pressure creates stillness rather than strain. The city is no longer an interruption in the land, it is a reinforcement. The valley's surface smooths itself over time. Small irregularities fade. The outlines of buried platforms soften but never disappear completely. They influence slope and runoff in subtle ways. The land behaves differently where structure exists beneath it. This difference remains consistent. It does not wander or repeat. It becomes the new normal. The climate continues its restrained patterns. Light winds pass regularly. They move sand without aggression. They never expose what lies beneath. They only rearrange the surface skin. The city remains insulated from these movements. The depth of burial increases slowly, evenly. This depth protects without suffocating. The materials below continue to exist in a stable environment. The dryness persists. The absence of organic activity remains pronounced. This absence slows transformation. The city's form continues to be readable internally. Even as edges soften, the relationships between spaces remain intact. Rooms stay rooms. Platforms stay platforms. The logic of movement remains clear even without movement. The design choices made at the beginning continue to govern behavior long after behavior has ceased. This endurance comes from restraint. The builders did not overload the land. The city does not fight gravity. It cooperates with it. This cooperation allows it to remain. The valley's internal temperatures remain steady. There are no sharp fluctuations underground. This stability prevents expansion stress. It prevents cracking. It allows materials to rest in equilibrium. The stone does not fatigue. The mud does not crumble. The remaining fibers that once bound components together have long since returned to soil, but the impressions they left behind continue to guide structure. These impressions act like memory channels. They maintain spacing, they preserve alignment. The city's construction continues to function through negative space rather than material presence. This absence spaced stability is another reason decay remains slow. The land above continues to respond predictably to rain. Rare water events pass over the surface quickly. They never pool. They never penetrate deeply. The drainage patterns established by the city's original layout still function invisibly. They guide water away from sensitive areas. These channels remain effective because they were designed to follow gravity rather than oppose it. The valley benefits from this guidance. The city benefits from it as well. The relationship remains mutually reinforcing. Time moves forward without punctuation. There are no markers. There is no awareness of duration. The city does not experience milestones. It simply continues to exist within accumulating layers. The soil compacts further. The air pockets reduce gradually. This compression happens evenly. There is no collapse. There is no sudden loss of volume. The structures settle deeper into stability. The deeper they go, the less vulnerable they become. The city's presence becomes more permanent as it becomes less visible. This paradox defines its long existence. The animals that cross the valley continue their routines. They follow the easiest paths. They avoid loose ground. They pass over areas reinforced by buried stone without knowing why. These patterns become habitual. They reinforce preservation by preventing random disturbance. The city guides behavior without being perceived. This quiet influence persists indefinitely. The valley remains quiet because nothing demands attention here. The absence of obvious resources discourages sustained occupation. The surface offers little incentive to dig deeply. The city remains protected by this lack of temptation. The builders anticipated this outcome. They chose a place that would not attract later intrusion. Sky continues its unbroken rhythm. The city's orientation remains meaningful even without observers. It still aligns with seasonal transitions. These alignments continue to exist as relationships rather than events. The city remains connected to cycles that do not require participation. This connection anchors it beyond social time. The narrative continues forward in a straight line. There's no return to construction. There's no revisiting of use. There's no rediscovery within this flow. The city remains in its settled state, unchanged in purpose because purpose has already concluded. The remaining story is one of persistence rather than action. The valley continues to carry the city quietly. The desert continues its patient covering. The river continues its distant shaping. The sky continues its endless turning. The city remains exactly where it has been for a very long time, held securely within the land, its existence moving steadily forward without repetition, without interruption, without looping back into what it once was. The valley maintains its quiet agreement with everything it holds. Nothing challenges this agreement because nothing arrives with urgency. The buried city remains settled into the ground like a resolved decision. The earth has already accepted its weight and adjusted accordingly. There is no tension left to release. The pressure has distributed evenly. The stones no longer shift independently. They move as part of a larger mass. This collective stability is what allows endurance. The city is no longer a collection of structures. It is a single condition within the valley. The soil above continues to compact at an almost imperceptible pace. Each grain settles into a more efficient arrangement. The air between particles thins. This compaction creates firmness rather than fragility. The surface becomes resistant to disruption. This resistance protects what lies below. The city benefits from being beneath ground that no longer yields easily. The dryness persists as a defining feature. Moisture remains scarce, brief. When it appears, it passes through predictable paths without lingering. These paths were shaped long ago by careful planning. They continue to function because gravity has not changed. The city's creators aligned their work with forces that remain constant. This alignment ensures continued effectiveness. The stone surfaces underground remain cool and consistent in temperature. This consistency prevents stress fractures. The materials remain relaxed within their environment. The city's interior spaces continue to exist as defined volumes. Even when filled, they preserve their boundaries. These boundaries maintain the logic of the layout. They ensure that the city remains intelligible even in complete silence. The relationships between plazas, platforms, and corridors remain coherent. This coherence is the city's final form. It does not depend on activity. It depends on proportion. The valley's wind continues to skim the surface. It never digs. It never tears. It smooths rather than disrupts. This smoothing action slowly erases sharp surface features but reinforces underlying structure. The buried platforms influence airflow subtly. They guide wind around gentle rises and dips. These patterns remain stable. They prevent erosion from focusing on any one point. The city remains protected by this distributed interaction. The animals continue their quiet crossings. They pause where ground holds warmth. They move where footing feels secure. These preferences align perfectly with the buried structures. The city provides stability without exposure. This harmony ensures preservation. The animals never disturb what supports them. The deeper layers of soil continue to insulate the city from sound and vibration. The occasional tremor passes through as a soft wave. It dissipates evenly because the structures distribute stress effectively. There's no focal point for damage. The city absorbs motion rather than amplifying it. This ability comes from mass and cohesion rather than rigidity. The builders understood this balance intuitively. They built to last by allowing movement rather than resisting it. This allowance continues to function. The narrative of the city continues forward without interruption. There are no sudden changes, no new phases. The city remains in its final state of being. It is no longer transitioning. It has arrived. This arrival is not dramatic. It is simply stable. The valley does not mark this moment. It does not need to. The city's presence is already fully integrated. The surface above continues to behave as if the city has always been there. This behavior becomes habitual. The land forgets that there was ever a distinction. The city becomes just another layer of the valley structure. The sky continues its steady progression. The patterns overhead remain consistent. The city's orientation still corresponds perfectly to these patterns. This correspondence continues even without observation. It reinforces the sense that the city exists within a larger order that does not require acknowledgement. The river remains distant but influential. It continues to define the valley's character. The dryness persists because the river's path never shifts toward the buried city. This distance maintains balance. The city remains safe from saturation and erosion. This safety was built into its placement. The builders anticipated the river's behavior. They chose distance deliberately. The story continues forward without looping back. There is no return to earlier states. There is no revival. There is no decay into chaos. The city remains exactly what it became after dispersal. This permanence is quiet but complete. The valley continues to hold the city without effort. The desert continues its patient covering. The sky continues its endless movement. The city remains within these forces, unchanged in essence, carried forward calmly through time, never repeating, never reversing, simply continuing as part of the land itself. The valley breathes in a way that never announces itself. There is no visible rise or fall, no signal of effort, yet the land continues its quiet exchange of warmth and coolness, of pressure and release. The buried city remains perfectly positioned within this exchange. It neither resists nor accelerates it. The stones have fully surrendered to gravity, and gravity has accepted them without strain. This mutual acceptance removes conflict entirely. The city no longer holds tension from its making. It exists in a state of rest that feels intentional rather than abandoned. The layers above continue to thicken slowly. Sediment arrives, grain by grain, never as a rush. Each grain finds its place and stays. The surface grows denser, more unified. This density protects what lies beneath from intrusion. The city benefits from this sealing. The deeper it becomes, the less likely disturbance becomes. The materials below continue to respond predictably to their environment. There are no surprises left for them. The dryness persists as the dominant condition. It defines everything. It keeps chemical reactions slow. It limits biological activity. It preserves shape and proportion. The city remains remarkably unchanged because nothing encourages rapid transformation. The structures remain legible beneath the earth. The alignment of platforms still follows clear intention. The spacing between forms still reflects careful planning. This clarity persists because the city was built on logic rather than ornament. Logic does not erode easily. The valley's winds continue to follow established paths. They skim over gentle rises. They curve around subtle depressions. These movements never expose buried edges. They only polish the surface. The city remains protected by this consistency. The land has learned how to behave above it. It does not deviate. The animals continue their instinctive movements. They cross where the ground feels trustworthy. They avoid loose patches. The buried stone provides reassurance without visibility. This reassurance shapes paths over time. These paths become habits. These habits reinforce preservation. The city remains untouched because it quietly supports the routines of the living without revealing itself. The underground environment remains stable. Temperature differences smooth out with depth. This stability prevents expansion, contraction cycles that cause damage. The city's materials rest in equilibrium. They no longer experience stress. They simply exist. The impressions left by construction remain intact even as materials soften slightly, edges round without losing alignment, corners ease without collapsing. The overall geometry remains readable. The city's decline concluded long ago. What remains is not decay, but persistence. This persistence does not require maintenance. It results from compatibility between design and environment. The builders chose forms that suited the land. They chose a place that suited those forms. This harmony continues to protect the city long after intention has faded. The valley itself is adapted around the buried structures. The surface contours reflect hidden support. These contours stabilize soil movement. They prevent erosion from focusing in destructive ways. The city remains secure because it shapes the land's behavior without effort. The river continues its distant presence. It does not approach. It does not threaten. Its influence remains indirect, maintaining dryness and limiting vegetation. This absence of growth prevents roots from penetrating deeply. The city remains undisturbed by biological intrusion. This protection is quiet and continuous. The sky continues its predictable cycles. The city's orientation remains aligned with these movements. This alignment no longer serves ritual or gathering, but it still anchors the city within a larger rhythm. This rhythm does not require observers, it exists independently. The city participates simply by existing correctly within it. The narrative continues forward in a single direction. There are no returns, no echoes of beginnings. The city does not relive its construction or its use. It remains in its settled state. This state deepens with time, but never changes character. The valley continues to hold the city as part of itself. The desert continues its gentle covering. The sky continues its endless turning. The city remains steady, integrated, unchanging in essence, carried forward quietly through time, without looping, without interruption, without ever needing to become something else. The valley continues its slow adjustment without ever needing correction. The land does not reconsider what it holds. It has already accounted for the weight beneath it and redistributed that weight evenly through layers that no longer remember disturbance. The buried city remains suspended in this equilibrium. The stones are fully at rest. They no longer press downward with urgency. They simply occupy space that has already accepted them. This acceptance removes all strain. The city does not age in any meaningful way. It only settles more deeply into belonging. The soil above grows increasingly unified. Individual grains lose their independence as compaction increases. This unity creates resistance to movement. The surface becomes firm, almost sealed. This sealing limits exchange with what lies below the city. Benefits from this isolation. It remains insulated from surface fluctuations. The dryness persists as the dominant condition. It continues to suppress chemical change and biological activity. The absence of moisture remains consistent and predictable. This predictability preserves structure. The city's internal spaces remain defined. Even as materials soften slightly, they do so evenly. There are no weak points. The design distributes stress broadly. This distribution prevents collapse. The builders understood this balance. They avoided concentration of force. They allowed weight to spread naturally. This understanding continues to protect the city long after its purpose has ended. The valley's winds maintain their gentle patterns. They do not accelerate unexpectedly. They do not scour deeply. They smooth and redistribute without aggression. This gentleness preserves surface integrity. The buried structures influence airflow subtly. They create minute variations in temperature and pressure. These variations guide wind paths without resistance. The land learns these patterns and repeats them consistently. The city remains safe beneath this repetition. The animals that pass through the valley continue to follow established routes. They trust the ground that feels firm. They avoid areas that shift unexpectedly. The buried stone provides consistent support. This support shapes movement over generations. These movements never disturb the structures. They reinforce preservation by limiting random disruption. The city influences behavior without visibility. This influence persists because it aligns with instinct rather than instruction. The underground environment remains remarkably stable. Temperature gradients flatten with depth. This stability eliminates stress cycles. The materials remain relaxed. They do not expand or contract enough to cause damage. The impressions left by construction remain legible. These impressions guide how pressure distributes. They preserve alignment even when original materials have softened or returned to soil. The city remains coherent because its logic is embedded space rather than surface detail. The valley's rare water events continue to pass quickly. They follow paths of least resistance shaped long ago. These paths avoid sensitive areas. They carry moisture away efficiently. This efficiency prevents saturation and erosion. The city remains dry and secure. The builders anticipated these events. They aligned drainage with gravity rather than opposing it. This alignment remains effective because gravity does not change. The river continues its distant influence. It defines the valley's character without approaching the buried city. This distance maintains dryness and discourages vegetation. Deep roots never develop. The city remains undisturbed by biological intrusion. This absence of growth further stabilizes the environment. The sky continues its steady progression. The city's orientation remains aligned with celestial cycles. This alignment persists as a relationship rather than a function. It anchors the city within rhythms that do not require observation. The city participates simply by existing correctly within these cycles. Time moves forward without punctuation. There are no events that alter the city's state. It remains in its final condition. This condition is not decay, but completion. The city has reached a point where further change only deepens stability. The valley continues to behave as if the city has always been there. This behavior becomes permanent. The distinction between natural and built dissolves completely. The city becomes another layer of the land's internal structure. The soil above responds consistently to pressure and moisture. It does not slump or crack. It holds together because underlying support remains constant. The buried platforms continue to distribute weight evenly. These distributions prevent surface failure. The city protects itself by supporting the land that covers it. The wind continues its repetitive work. It never exposes what lies beneath. It only rearranges the surface gently. The animals continue their quiet crossings. They pause briefly where ground holds warmth. They move on without disturbance. These interactions remain light and non-invasive. The city remains untouched because it offers stability without revealing itself. The underground remains insulated from sound and vibration. Minor tremors pass through without focus. They dissipate evenly across mass and cohesion. There is no amplification. There is no damage. The builders understood how to allow movement without fracture. This understanding remains embedded in the city's form. The narrative continues forward in a straight line. There are no returns to beginnings, no revisiting of earlier states. The city does not cycle through use and abandonment. It remains in its settled state. This state deepens but never changes character. The valley continues to hold the city quietly. The desert continues its patient covering. The sky continues its endless turning. The city remains integrated, unchanging in essence, carried forward steadily through time without looping, without interruption, without ever needing to become something else. The valley moves onward without urgency. The desert does not hurry toward conclusions. It allows each moment to exist fully before yielding to the next. The buried city remains steady within this flow, not paused, but completed. The stones have finished their work. They no longer anticipate use or response. They simply remain holding form without expectation. The silence around them is not absence but balance. Sound is unnecessary here because nothing requires signaling. The city exists in quiet agreement with its surroundings. This agreement deepens as seasons pass without remark. The light above shifts gradually across the surface. The buried structures feel this change only as a soft modulation of warmth. It is never sharp enough to disturb internal harmony. The materials respond together. They warm and cool as one body. This unity prevents strain. The city behaves less like a collection of buildings and more like a single geological feature. The desert recognizes this and treats it accordingly. The sand settles evenly, never testing the underlying form. The city continues to support what covers it. The valley's contours become subtly smoother over time. This smoothing is not erosion but refinement. The buried architecture encourages even distribution. The land benefits from this unseen order. It holds together more effectively because of what lies beneath. The city improves the valley simply by remaining intact. The relationship remains reciprocal. The desert preserves the city. The city stabilizes the desert. This mutual reinforcement requires no awareness. It operates automatically. The passing of years leaves no mark that matters. Time does not accumulate here as damage. It accumulates as confirmation. Each year that passes without disturbance proves the correctness of the original design. The builders could not have predicted everything, but they understood principles that outlast intention. They built with patience rather than urgency. They accepted limits rather than forcing outcomes. This acceptance remains visible in how the structures age. They do not resist change aggressively. They accommodate it gently. This accommodation prevents failure. The city never fractures because it never insists. The valley continues its long rhythms. Rare rains fall and vanish. Their brief presence never lingers long enough to disrupt balance. The water follows established paths and disappears into distance. The city remains dry and composed. The earth above compresses further. This compression increases protection rather than pressure. The deeper the city settles, the safer it becomes. The stones are no longer vulnerable because they no longer protrude. They belong fully to the earth's interior. The desert's temperature extremes never reach them. They remain insulated within consistent conditions. This consistency allows details to survive. Edges soften slightly but never lose definition. The forms remain readable, even as textures mellow. The city retains its identity without needing visibility. The animals continue to pass overhead. They sense stability without understanding cause. They prefer solid ground and predictable warmth. The buried city provides both. These preferences guide movement unconsciously. This guidance further protects the site by discouraging disruptive behavior. The city influences life above without ever announcing itself. The stars continue their predictable paths. The city remains aligned with these movements. This alignment does not require observation to remain meaningful. It exists as a relationship embedded in geometry rather than ritual. The city participates passively. It does not mark time. It rests within it. The valley continues to age gracefully. It does not accumulate scars because nothing challenges its equilibrium. The buried city contributes to this calm by absorbing stress that might otherwise manifest as cracks or shifts. The desert becomes more stable because the city is there. This stability reinforces the desert's quiet character. The narrative moves forward without repetition. There is no return to beginnings. The city does not cycle through phases. It remains in its final state. This state is neither ruin nor abandonment. It is resolution. The builder's intentions have completed their journey. The structures no longer seek purpose. They have become purpose themselves. The valley accepts this without commentary. The desert continues its endless patience. The city remains integrated, complete, and unmoving in essence. It does not fade. It does not rise again. It simply endures, fully settled into the long, unbroken flow of time where nothing needs to happen next for meaning to remain intact.